Hello everybody, my name is Jeff Jenness. I'm the GIS analyst at the Spring Stewardship Institute, affiliated with the Museum of Northern Arizona in Flagstaff, Arizona. I'd like to show you Springs Online, our comprehensive database of spring ecosystems, and how we're using it to support long-term monitoring of spring snail species in Nevada and Utah. Now, long-term data sets are a critical tool these days. It's no surprise to anyone watching this, but our world is changing rapidly. It's been obvious for decades. Climate change, increasing human population, pollution, environmental contamination, spread of invasive species all create increasing and evolving demands on the environment. Ecosystems are under pressure. They're almost always changing, sometimes fracturing, and sometimes collapsing. Species are going extinct at a rate greater than at any time in the last 66 million years. To properly understand how ecosystems react to these pressures over time, we need to monitor them over long time periods, and therefore we need long-term data sets, which is, of course, the focus of this symposium. And this leads us to springs. Spring ecosystems are among the most biologically diverse places on the landscape, especially in dry climates. This spring in the Grand Canyon, for example, has over 30 vertebrate species that have been recorded there, over 180 invertebrates, and 70 different plant species. They are critical ecological hotspots that provide stable and protected zones that shelter and support almost all species in the region. With very few exceptions, every perennial water source in the southwestern United States starts at a spring. They have great cultural and economic significance, with some cultures considering springs to be emergence points where people first came into the world, and others relying on them to survive in times of struggle. They support homes, ranches, and farms, and an enormous variety of spring-sourced bottled water. When the water supply is stable, these sites can serve as a buffer to short-term drought, as long-term refugia from climate change. When the spring itself is isolated and out of existing flow channels, these areas can evolve into remarkably complex communities hosting numerous rare and endemic species. Devil's Hole in Nevada, for example, hosts the Devil's Hole pupfish, which has been isolated in this tiny pool for over 10,000 years. Montezuma's Well in central Arizona is definitely in the running for having the highest reported concentration of species that exist only at a single location of any spring in North America. Dean Blinn, for example, reports 5 species, which 1 diatom and 4 invertebrates, while the Springs Online database reports 4 spring obligate invertebrates that have only been reported at this site. And this leads us to Springs Online, our online database for all things spring-related. Springs Online is a large and very complex database with extensive data on springs. It has nearly 1,000 users now that are actively working with it. It has close to 160,000 springs and over 20,000 surveys recorded, and constant edits going on. Springs Online is our flagship product and forms the foundation for everything else we do at the Spring Stewardship Institute. This database stores a large amount of data about springs and spring ecosystems. It's really an extremely powerful tool for understanding these fantastically complex and diverse biotic communities. In addition to simply storing data, Springs Online also lets you generate a large number of automated summary reports that describe various aspects of springs and the surveys we conduct on them. And with regards to long-term data sets, one nice thing about planned long-term research projects is that you'll gather consistent and comparable data over time. You have a long-term question in mind and you design the study to answer that question. And this kind of thing is more difficult with ad hoc long-term data sets where different researchers study different things over time at each location. So anybody who's worked with multiple data sets from different researchers knows what I'm talking about here. Even when data are suitable for long-term analysis, they're often collected for different purposes and under different survey protocols, makes them very difficult to assemble into a single comprehensive and useful database. So this is one area where Springs Online really shines. We have integrated numerous spring survey protocols into our online interface that allow almost any type and level of survey to contribute to the total body of knowledge on springs, and in a way that the knowledge will later be useful to all users of the database. And we're always ready to add more protocol interfaces when we need to. And finally, we allow land managers to restrict access to springs and surveys when they feel that public knowledge of that spring might put the ecosystem or resident species at risk. The land managers themselves then have control over who to grant access to data regarding that spring. They have administrative access to the database and are able to grant and revoke access permissions without having to go through us to do it. Now, since the springs are spatial objects on the landscape, we often want to ask spatial questions of them. We want to know what springs may be affected by a fire, by a proposed management action. We want to look for relationships between ecological characteristics of the springs and proximity to roads or developments. So we also provide these spring locations as a geodatabase, and when we bring them into a GIS, we're able to ask complex spatial questions and find interesting patterns going on. We find that hanging garden springs are found more often in low elevations, while helicrines, which are basically wet meadows, are much more common at higher elevations. We find that both pH and specific conductance decrease with elevation. We find a strong spatial correlation between hot springs and tectonic boundaries. So the spatial characteristics of the Springs Online Geodatabase really open up a lot of opportunities for complex spatial analysis. And this brings us to the Springsnail Conservation Plan. I mentioned earlier that springs were hotspots of biological diversity, and spring snails are an excellent example. Spring snails are tiny, sometimes microscopic species that live in springs ecosystems. These ecosystems host a large number of endemic snails, organisms that evolved uniquely to live exclusively in a specific spring's habitat or complex. In this way, springs support incredible diversity in arid land states like Nevada and Utah. Spring snails are an excellent representation of the incredible biodiversity that springs provide. There are well over 100 known species of spring snails in the states of Utah and Nevada alone, over 178 in the general Southwest. Likely there are more to be discovered. Spring snails serve an important role in their environment, recycling nutrients in the water. And in this way, they are integral organisms within spring ecosystems. They also serve as indicator species. Their presence often indicates that the conditions of the water quality and spring structure are ideal to support life. Perhaps most importantly, spring snails are umbrella species. In states like Nevada and Utah, drought, global climate change, and growing population demands have led to profound threats to the natural aquatic ecosystems. Ground pumping and climate change deplete an already limited resource. In these states, springs are essential sources of fresh water for people, plants, and wildlife. Now, perennial springs ecosystems are at high risk of disappearing from the landscape because of increasing human demands for water, habitat alteration, and climate change. But until then, they continue to provide irreplaceable habitat to aquatic life. Protection of spring snails is protection of springs and the incredible wealth of life that they sustain. And the decline of valuable springs habitat has led the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, state wildlife agencies, and other NGOs to invoke protection of some species of spring snails under the Endangered Species Act and state statutes. In 2018, the Spring Stewardship Institute collaborated with Nevada Department of Wildlife, the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, Fish and Wildlife Service, and numerous other NGOs and state and federal agencies to initiate the development of the Springsnail Conservation Strategy for states in Nevada and Utah to better manage and protect 103 spring snail species and their ecosystems. This spring snail strategy provides an integrated plan for the largest spring stewardship plan in the nation and works toward 5 primary goals. First, to identify, assess, and reduce threats to 103 spring snail taxa and their habitats. Second, to maintain, enhance, and restore habitats. Then to develop a spring snail conservation team, then to create an effective education and outreach program for landowners, agencies, and the general public, and finally and especially to compile spring snail ecology and distribution data into a single database, which of course is contained in Springs Online. Now this last goal provides the long-term data set that lets us accomplish the other 4. To this end, we have compiled existing research, published literature, and additional data sets in our Springs Online database to build a comprehensive data set of population distribution, habitat conditions, conservation status, and survey history of each species. Few of these surveys go back to the 1890s, but 98% are from the last 50 years, and research is ongoing. New surveys are conducted and entered in the database on a regular basis. According to Springs Online, over 90 researchers have contributed to this robust data set. As you can imagine, having 90-plus researchers over the decades each with their own methods and goals for surveying, and each with their own method of recording and storing data, present a very difficult data aggregation problem. We could not have done this without the flexibility of Springs Online, plus months of work from data technicians. Now, drawing from the data in Springs Online, we mapped the distribution of these spring snail species across the states of Nevada and Utah. To date, these species have been observed at 1,212 out of roughly 40,000 springs in or near Nevada and Utah, and it's roughly 3% of the springs in these two states. A few spring snail species, such as Pergolopsis gibba and Pergolopsis colobensis, are widely distributed across the Southwest, while 35 spring snail species are restricted to only 1 or 2 spring locations and thus are highly vulnerable to habitat degradation or loss. 15 of these 35 species were last observed and recorded in a survey prior to 2001, suggesting either a lack of recent survey effort or possible extirpation of the species. The spring snail species in Nevada and Utah are classified as either extirpated, critically imperiled, vulnerable, or secure. A few species have never been classified, and these classifications follow the NatureServe Conservation Classification System. Great majority of spring snail species are either extirpated or critically imperiled. This includes 76% of Pergolopsis species and 63% of all other spring snail genera. Now here we show the regions containing spring snail species that exist at only 1 or 2 springs, and these species are among the most at risk, could go extinct if the spring is damaged or destroyed. Just to clarify, in this series of maps I'm showing, we're summarizing data within a hexagonal array over the landscape, so we're mapping spring snail characteristics within each hexagon. We're not showing exact spring locations in these maps. Now we have 3 regions where the spring snail species appear to have gone extinct. Now, critically imperiled means there's 5 or fewer locations or less than 1,000 individuals. Most of these regions with critically imperiled species occur in Nevada. These springs provide the most vitally important shelter to their resident species because a small change in the landscape could lead to extirpation or even total extinction of these species. Imperiled means 6 to 20 locations, or between 1 and 3,000 individuals, and these species are distributed fairly evenly between Nevada and Utah. Now, vulnerable means 21 to 100 locations, or 3 to 10,000 individuals, and for some reason these species are very heavily weighted toward western Nevada, and I'm not quite sure how to explain that. Secure means what it sounds like: common, widespread, abundant, lacking major threats or long-term concerns. Only a small fraction of species meet this definition. They're mostly found in eastern Nevada and western Utah. Then there's a few species that haven't been classified into NatureServe conservation classifications yet. Now these maps show general patterns of spring snail threats across Nevada and Utah, but we also look at each species individually. Springs Online allows us to not only map the distribution of species, but also to symbolize the species according to whether they were recorded on the last survey that visited the spring. And if the species was not recorded, that could mean either the species is no longer present, or else that the researcher just wasn't looking for spring snail species, or maybe even for invertebrates at all. It's kind of the nature of ad hoc data sets, so the best we can do is show that there might be a cause for concern. We can also symbolize by whether the last recorded observation at that spring was before some date, which helps us spot cases where a species has not been observed for a long time. And we can also generate summary reports that include these maps, as well as a thorough summary of habitat characteristics recorded at each spring. And these summary reports help us understand the spatial distribution and habitat requirements of the species, as well as which land managers are primarily responsible for the springs that the species depend on. Now, in sum, I'd like to reiterate that these long-term datasets are critical to understanding how our ecosystem is responding to the severe pressures we're putting on it. Second, springs ecosystems are critical ecological hotspots, hosting and supporting almost all species in the landscape, and they provide refuge and shelter from drought and climate change. As such, they're prime candidates for long-term study. And finally, the Springsnail Conservation Strategy is a case study that demonstrates the successful implementation of Springs Online to assess threats to these species and to develop a plan to maintain and restore their habitats. And with that, I'd like to thank our partners in this ongoing project, and I thank you all for watching. I leave you with some words of wisdom to guide you in these troubled times.